Door to the unseen. The library's whisper. I first heard the library before I ever saw it. The creaking of ancient floorboards called to me from the far end of the hallway, echoing as though they were alive. I'd inherited my grandfather's estate just 2 weeks prior, an old, ivy-covered manor perched on a rugged cliff near the sea. Its corridors were narrow and seemingly endless, each leading to rooms filled with dust-laden furniture and unopened trunks. But it was the library that whispered, beckoning me with a soft hush that was impossible to ignore. By day, the library seemed only slightly unsettling. Rows of worn leather-bound books on towering shelves, a massive grandfather clock whose pendulum swung like a judge's gavel, dictating the slow passage of time. When dusk fell, the atmosphere transformed. The shadows lengthened, the clock seemed louder, and the silence pressed in, thick and cloying. I could almost feel the walls breathing with me, my pulse matching the ticking that refused to stop. As I swept my flashlight across the shelves one evening, I felt an unusual breeze stir the edges of a threadbare rug. The air shifted, and somewhere behind the tall shelves, a faint thump resonated, like something had been disturbed. In that moment, a chill snaked down my spine, and I could have sworn I heard a soft, distant rasp, as if the library itself was trying to tell me its secrets. A strange discovery. I'd visited the library multiple times in the days following that first eerie encounter. Something about that soft sound, part sigh, part whisper, gnawed at me. My grandfather had been a collector of rare books and eccentric curiosities, so every inch of the room was packed with potential secrets. I methodically moved each dusty tome, half expecting to discover hidden compartments or tattered maps. What I found instead was far more unsettling. Behind a shelf of ancient Latin volumes, I noticed a narrow gap in the paneling. A thick layer of dust coated the edges, suggesting no one had touched it in decades, maybe centuries. My curiosity flared, and I pressed my fingers against the wood. It gave way with a groan, revealing a small door, no more than 4 feet high, concealed in the wall. The frame was wrought iron, etched with ornate carvings that looked oddly like human faces twisted in silent screams. I kneeled, shining my flashlight onto the metal surface. My reflection stared back from the tarnished iron, and in that brief moment, it felt like I was peering into something else's eyes, something trapped behind that door, silently urging me to open it. Trembling, I reached for the handle. Cold as ice, it refused to budge at first. My heart hammered as I pulled again, half hoping it was locked forever. Then, with a metallic scrape, the handle turned. The sealed threshold. I hesitated before opening that strange, miniature door. Every instinct told me to leave it sealed, to pretend I'd never found it. But an inexplicable pull guided my hand to the iron handle again. This time, I gave a gentle tug, and it opened smoothly, as if waiting for me all along. The darkness beyond that threshold seemed to devour the beam of my flashlight. I leaned forward, squinting into the pitch-black interior. A stale gust of air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else, something sweet yet rotten. It reminded me of overripe fruit left to fester in a cellar. My stomach churned, and goosebumps rippled across my arms. The corridor beyond the door looked narrow, carved from rough stone, and sloped downward at a subtle angle. There was no immediate sign of stairs, just a descending tunnel that disappeared into darkness. Despite my better judgment, I set one foot inside, bracing myself against the cramped walls. Almost immediately, an unnatural chill seeped into my bones, as though the corridor itself was alive with malevolent intent. It felt like stepping into another world, one hidden and dangerous, where light had been banished. My breathing grew ragged, and for a moment, I feared I would lose my nerve. Then I spotted the faint outline of another door at the far end. A sense of foreboding washed over me. A door behind a door, deeper in the shadows. Nightmares stirring. I decided that venturing deeper alone would be madness. Gathering my courage, I closed the small iron door and locked it firmly. That night, sleep refused to come. I heard every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the windows. When at last I drifted off, My dreams were invaded by half-formed figures with hollow eyes and twisting limbs. They seemed to reach for me, beckoning with rasping voices and pointing with elongated fingers. I jolted awake at dawn, drenched in sweat, my heart pummeling my ribcage. Later that morning, I dug through my grandfather's diaries, hoping to find any clue about this hidden passage. One entry, dated decades ago, stood out. The door is a threshold to the place where nightmares hide. Each night, the veil grows thinner. I must guard it, or all will be lost. My grandfather's scrawling handwriting became almost illegible by the final words, but I understood enough. He'd known about the corridor and had spent years protecting it, ensuring whatever lurked beyond never escaped. Unease coiled in my stomach as I realized I had unwittingly reopened what my grandfather had likely fought so hard to keep sealed. Nightmares stirring, the veil thinning. A cosmic dread settled over me. I could feel something about to erupt from behind that door, something that fed on our darkest fears. Each moment I delayed, that intangible barrier between our world and the horror beyond grew frilier. Whispers in the dark. Determined to learn more, I returned to the hidden door the next evening. This time, I brought a lantern, a camera, and my trembling resolve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the library's corners deepened in shadow, and the old grandfather clock's chimes seemed unnaturally loud. My breath echoed in the hush as I approached the concealed panel. Strangely, it was already slightly ajar. A cold draft slid past me, rustling the pages of an open book left on a table. I froze, heart thudding. Had I not locked it before? Yes, I remembered turning the key. My mind spun with possibilities. Perhaps I had misremembered, or maybe something else had unlocked it from within. My throat tightened at the thought. I gripped the lantern's handle and stepped inside the narrow corridor once more. The air felt somehow thicker, denser, charged with a quiet malevolence that pressed on my senses. My own footsteps sounded amplified, echoing as though the stone passage was feeding on every noise. I crept forward, my lantern's glow slicing through the darkness. At the end of the corridor, the second door loomed again, more imposing than I recalled. As I neared it, I could have sworn I heard faint whispers, skittering like insects on the edge of my hearing. A wave of nausea struck, and I nearly doubled over. Whatever was on the other side was awake, and it knew I was there, a distant echo. I retreated from the corridor before opening that second door. Fear had rooted me in place, and I couldn't bring myself to discover what lay beyond. Back in the library, I found myself clutching my grandfather's diary again, flipping to a particular passage I'd overlooked earlier. A single line leaped from the page. They feed on our despair, shaping nightmares into reality. My stomach turned. If something was indeed feeding on my fear, entering that space while trembling was practically an invitation for it to grow stronger. I decided to confide in an old friend, Marcus, a historian with a penchant for the occult. When I showed him the diary, he grew uncharacteristically pale. These symbols, he whispered, pointing to the crude sketches of twisted shapes, suggest a realm shaped by human terror. It's sometimes referred to in mythic texts as the unseen, a place where nightmares take corporeal form, sustained by the fear of living minds. We spent hours poring over every reference we could find, piling books upon the dining table. Candlelight flickered as the wind outside rattled the shutters. I was reminded of how tenuous our world felt at night, how the boundary between waking and dreaming thinned. Marcus read passages aloud, writings of ancient guardians, tales of those who had glimpsed the unseen and never returned. The words crawled under my skin, each one a distant echo of my worst imaginings. By the time the candles burned low, we both knew one truth. I had to confront that door, but I had to do so without succumbing to the terror that radiated from within. The key. The next morning, a dim, overcast sky gave the manor an even gloomier cast. Marcus and I scoured the house, searching for any protective talisman or object my grandfather might have used to seal the door. We discovered a tarnished key tucked away in a hidden compartment in the study. Its bow was carved with runes similar to those on the corridor's frame. A folded note accompanied it, written in my grandfather's hand, the only key to lock the unseen. Uncertain but hopeful, we returned to the library and faced the small iron door. The key slid into the lock with an almost eager click, as though it recognized its purpose. My spine prickled. The library was unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. We opened the panel to find the hidden corridor exactly as before. Dark, damp, and disquieting. But this time it felt less hostile, perhaps because Marcus was with me and we both carried that protective key. I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor itself was watching, pulsing with a slow, steady heartbeat of dread. At the far end, the second door loomed again. Marcus shone a flashlight on its surface, revealing more intricate carvings of writhing figures. I steadied myself and gently pressed the key against the door's lock. For a fraction of a second, I sensed a force pushing back, a defiant pulse from within. Then, almost anticlimactically, the door yielded. It swung inward, revealing an impossible darkness beyond, deeper than any earthly night. When darkness slips, even with Marcus by my side, stepping through that threshold was like being swallowed by living shadow. The lantern's glow extended only a few feet, and beyond that lay a world of swirling black. My senses were immediately assaulted by an indescribable pressure in the air, as though it were thick with whispering thoughts. Strange shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, dissolving whenever I tried to focus on them. We moved forward slowly, our footsteps echoing on the unseen floor. The very texture beneath our feet felt uneven, shifting in subtle, disorienting ways. The oppressive quiet was occasionally broken by distant sounds. A low moan, an unearthly hiss, the scraping of unseen claws against a surface. My pulse hammered in my temples, and I caught Marcus's expression. Wide-eyed, lips set in a grim line. Whatever we faced here was beyond anything we had imagined. We soon realized this was no ordinary space. The interior seemed far larger than the manor could contain, an entire dimension hidden behind stone and iron. Sinister shapes flitted in the blackness, occasionally illuminated by a faint, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, constantly shifting, reaching for us with intangible limbs. My heart felt ready to burst from my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. We couldn't turn back yet. If this was truly the realm that molded nightmares into reality, we had to find a way to seal it forever, or risk letting its horrors slip into our world. The Mirror of Fears. As we ventured deeper, our lantern finally revealed a bizarre structure at the center of the darkness. A standing mirror, tall and ornate, framed with twisted metal vines. Its surface was opaque, more like liquid shadow than a reflection. I felt an immediate surge of revulsion. Something inside me screamed to avoid looking at it, but I couldn't resist the pull. Stepping closer, I noticed my silhouette rippling across the surface, though no real reflection appeared. Then, without warning, the mirror cleared, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. I saw myself as a child, cowering in a dark closet while a monstrous figure loomed behind me. My childhood nightmare, the terror that once kept me awake at night, now played out vividly in this living mirror. The grotesque creature's wet breath raked my neck, and I let out an involuntary cry. Marcus grabbed my shoulder, eyes transfixed by his own terror reflected beside mine, some twisted specter of his past. It was as though the mirror was drawing on our most personal horrors, manifesting them in a way that felt all too real. My mind spun, wrestling with how something intangible could manipulate my memories so precisely. I forced myself to look away. The key in my pocket felt suddenly heavy, as though resonating with the mirror's dark power. I realized that if we lingered, these manifestations might become more than mere reflections. They could cross the veil into physical existence. We backed away from the mirror, hearts racing, the sense of doom intensifying with each step. The first nightmare. We hadn't ventured far from the mirror when a monstrous screech ripped through the darkness. At first, I thought it was just another echo, but then something heavy barreled toward us, its footsteps pounding on a surface I couldn't see. Marcus aimed his flashlight wildly, illuminating a grotesque figure that had no right existing outside a dream. Its limbs were elongated, ending in jagged talons. His face, it barely had one, just a maw of twisting jaws where a mouth should be. Terror slammed into me. In that moment, I recognized it from the mirror. A twisted amalgamation of my childhood nightmares, now unleashed into reality. Its eyes glowed with a sickly white light as it lunged. I stumbled backward, the lantern crashing to the ground. Marcus grabbed me by the arm, yanking me to my feet. In our scramble to escape, I fumbled for the key, as if it were some sort of talisman that might ward off this abomination. The creature let out another shriek and swung its talons, narrowly missing my shoulder. Fear electrified my body, but a small voice inside told me to stand my ground. I raised the key, and for a split second, the runes on its bow flickered with an otherworldly glow. The nightmare reeled, hissing in agony, as if scorched by invisible flames. Its furious shriek reverberated in the darkness. Marcus and I seized the opportunity, retreating deeper into the realm. Terror pulsed in my veins, but also a flicker of hope. The key could hurt them. The librarian's secret. Amid our flight from that monstrosity, we spotted a faint glow in the distance, as though a soft candlelight was beckoning us. With nowhere else to run, we followed it. The darkness parted to reveal a small, hidden alcove filled with bookshelves, an impossible extension of the manor's library. Rows of tomes lined the walls, their spines etched with runic symbols similar to those in my grandfather's diaries. Seated at a small desk was a man, or rather, the spectral image of one. He looked old, with hollow cheeks and eyes rimmed in exhaustion. Dressed in a tattered waistcoat, he bore a remarkable resemblance to the portrait of the manor's original librarian I had seen in the main hall. Upon our approach, he lifted his eyes from the book he was reading, yet his expression remained distant, as if he was only half aware of our presence. "Guardians must bear the burden," he muttered, turning a brittle page. The door was never meant to be opened lightly. My spine tingled. The specter's voice reverberated through the alcove, overlapping with a strange echo. Marcus tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his lips. The old librarian's ghostly gaze fixed on me. "Your bloodline," he said, pointing a transparent finger. "You share the curse. You must seal it before it's too late." Before I could ask how, his image flickered and dissolved into smoke. In his place lay a small, ancient-looking tome. On its cover was the same symbol etched onto the key. My heart pounded. Another clue, perhaps the final piece of the puzzle left by those who came before. Escalation. We snatched up the ancient tome, flipping through its fragile pages. The text was written in archaic script, dense with cryptic symbols. Still, certain phrases leapt out, mentioning binding rituals, sealing incantations, and dire warnings of what would happen should the portal remain open. My breath caught in my throat as I realized these rites demanded sacrifice, but the type was unclear. Blood? Will? Sanity? The text was maddeningly vague. A distant roar echoed across the dark expanse, reminding us we weren't safe here. We needed to find a place to regroup, to piece together the ritual and figure out how to use the key properly. Retracing our steps, we headed back toward the second door, hoping to leave the unseen dimension and plan our next move. But the dark realm was shifting around us, warping the path we'd taken. The once straight corridor now branched like a labyrinth, each passageway identical and oppressive. Panic set in. The more we moved, the more disoriented we became. Voices rose in my mind, memories of childhood fears, nightmares I'd long suppressed. Marcus clutched the tome to his chest, his face pale with terror. It felt as if we were being toyed with, manipulated by the realm itself. After an agonizing hour, we spotted the faint outline of the second door. A wave of relief hit me as I jammed the key into the lock. It groaned open just enough for us to slip through, returning us to the hidden corridor. My chest heaved, and I nearly collapsed against the rough stone. We were back in the manor's reality, at least for now. The visitor from beyond. We stumbled into the library, half expecting the monstrous realm to follow us. The small iron door slammed shut, the protective key still gripped in my trembling hand. Marcus and I locked it again, determined to buy whatever time we could. But the dread that hung in the air didn't dissipate. It clung to the walls, to our clothing, like a vile residue. Night had fallen outside. Candles flickered ominously, casting long shadows across rows of forgotten books. My entire body felt spent, but rest was a luxury we couldn't afford. Marcus placed the ancient tome on a heavy wooden table, carefully flipping to the pages that spoke of sealing incantations. His voice was unsteady as he tried to sound out archaic phrases. Some words seemed impossible to pronounce, contorting the tongue in unnatural ways. Suddenly, the library's atmosphere shifted. A gust of wind slammed the shutters, and the temperature plummeted. We both spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. At first glance, it resembled a person cloaked in darkness, but a closer look revealed its disturbing form. A silhouette of twisting black mist barely containing a wraith-like shape. It took a step forward, and the wood beneath it groaned. My heart nearly stopped. Here was a nightmare from the unseen, somehow crossing the threshold into our reality. Its half-formed features turned toward me, as though sensing the bloodline that had brought it here. Shadows at dawn. We froze in terror. The entity's presence radiated cold so intense it seared my lungs. Each labored breath sent ice shards through my body. It glided toward us, leaving a trail of inky darkness. Marcus frantically rifled through the tome, looking for anything, any incantation or symbol, that could repel this intruder. My mind raced, recalling how the key had blazed with power inside the dimension. Maybe it could do the same here. Shaking, I raised the key and stepped between the entity and Marcus. The creature paused, its form rippling in agitation. An otherworldly growl reverberated in the library, shaking dust from the shelves. I willed the key to protect us, and to my surprise, a faint glow emanated from its runes. But it was weaker now, as if the barrier between realms had diminished its strength. The creature lunged, an inhuman shriek splitting the silence. I braced myself, key extended. A surge of energy erupted, throwing the entity backward. It screeched, swirling into a column of black mist that recoiled from the light. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the darkness evaporated. Staggering, I collapsed to my knees, sweaty fingers still curled around the key's handle. Marcus crouched beside me, terror etched across his face, his voice barely above a whisper. Dawn is coming, but the nightmares aren't waiting for night anymore. The tormented past. We didn't sleep. Instead, we devoured every word in that ancient tome by the flicker of candlelight. Gradually, the text began to make sense, revealing that my grandfather, and generations before him, had served as guardians. Through a complex ritual, they bound the nightmares to the unseen dimension, preventing them from fully manifesting in our reality. But the ritual had to be renewed once a generation, lest the barrier weaken. It appeared my grandfather's declining health had prevented him from performing the ceremony properly. Now it fell on me, the last of our line, to fulfill that duty. Marcus traced his finger across a diagram detailing the ritual. It required the guardian's blood, a spoken incantation, and the key to lock the dimension from within. My heart sank. From within meant I'd have to go back, face whatever monstrosities awaited there, and carry out this ritual. The very thought of returning to that place filled me with dread so potent I could taste it like bile. Before dawn's first rays, Marcus and I prepared. We gathered candles, chalk for runic circles, and a ceremonial knife that had been hidden among my grandfather's belongings. My hands trembled as I slid the blade into my belt, remembering the terror we'd already endured. Still, what choice did we have? If we failed, these nightmares would spill out into the world unchecked. Our dark inheritance was a burden we could neither deny nor escape. The price of knowledge. With grim resolve, we returned to the corridor. My hand trembled on the iron door's handle, remembering our last brush with the nightmares. Once inside, the stale air greeted us like a malevolent host, and I felt that familiar, suffocating sense of dread. This time, though, we came armed with knowledge and a desperate plan. We set up a rudimentary altar in the corridor itself, using chalk to outline a circle of runes drawn from the tome. Each symbol felt alive as I etched it into the stone, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Marcus placed a row of candles around the perimeter, their tiny flames flickering in the still air. The ancient incantation we needed to speak was scrawled on a page pinned open by a rock. Just as we were about to begin, the corridor lurched, as though the walls themselves were shifting. I stumbled, nearly toppling a candle. The murmur of voices swirled around us. Harsh, distorted voices in a language I didn't understand. Marcus looked at me, terror etched on his face. We both knew time was short. The realm beyond that second door sensed our intention to seal it. I pressed the ceremonial knife against my palm, wincing as it broke skin. Warm blood dripped onto the runes. In a trembling voice, I began reciting the incantation, each syllable tasting bitter on my tongue. The corridor darkened, and an icy wind whipped the candle's flames. We had started something we couldn't stop, and the price of this knowledge was about to be paid in fear and possibly blood. Gathering storm. Suddenly, the small iron door slammed shut behind us of its own accord, sealing Marcus and me inside the corridor. The runes glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like living creatures. The atmosphere crackled with energy, each breath feeling like an electric current passing through my lungs. I continued the incantation, voice straining against the mounting gale that tore through the narrow passage. The wail of the wind merged with distant shrieks, as if a legion of nightmares was howling in protest. Marcus clutched the ancient tome, shouting to be heard over the din, pointing at a line I'd missed. I forced my gaze to the page, heart pounding. The final step of the ritual required us to open the second door and carry the incantation into the very heart of the unseen realm. My stomach twisted at the thought, but the runes were clear. The barrier could only be sealed from within the dimension itself, where the nightmares were born. Steeling ourselves, we lifted the key and advanced to the second door, the corridor's wind pushing us forward as if eager to cast us into that unholy realm. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the lock. The door swung open, revealing the same yawning void we had barely escaped before. Lightning-like flickers danced in the darkness, illuminating fleeting shapes that defied comprehension. I took a deep breath, recalling my grandfather's words. They feed on our despair. I could not give them mine. The unseen awakens. The moment we stepped through the second door, chaos reigned. The darkness exploded with nightmarish shapes. Eyes, claws, and gaping maws swimming in the void. Each flicker of lightning revealed horrors beyond naming. Yet we pressed on, chanting in unison, the tome guiding our steps. The runes we had drawn on ourselves with chalk glowed faintly, offering minimal protection against the realm's oppressive malevolence. At the center of that shifting plane rose a looming structure, something akin to a massive altar formed from obsidian or petrified bone. Its surface pulsed with a sickly luminescence that seemed to anchor the nightmares around it. I sensed that this was the heart of the unseen, the point from which all horrors emanated. If we were to seal the dimension, we had to do it here. My nerves screamed at me to run as shapes lunged from the darkness, screeching and hissing. Marcus deflected one ghastly apparition with the key, the runes blazing bright enough to make it recoil. My stomach twisted with nausea, but I forced myself to continue the incantation, each syllable hammering against my teeth. The structure towered overhead, an abomination to natural law. I pressed my bloody hand against its surface, the final step of the binding ritual. For an instant, I felt connected to every nightmare that had ever existed within these walls, and they felt me. Shattered boundaries. As my blood touched the altar, a furious roar shook the unseen dimension. Lightning flared, revealing the legion of nightmares surging closer, merging into a single colossal manifestation. My vision blurred, fear coursing through me like venom. The boundary between sanity and madness felt razor-thin. Marcus clutched my arm, forcing me to meet his gaze. With resolve, we shouted the last line of the incantation, pressing the key against the altar. Light erupted, pure, searing light that forced the shadows into retreat. The monstrous shape shrieked, fracturing like glass under unimaginable pressure. A shockwave tore through the void, toppling us both. For a terrifying moment, I feared we had only enraged the nightmares further. But as the echo of that final roar faded, the swirling darkness began to collapse in on itself. The shapes flickered and vanished, leaving only emptiness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. It felt as if the realm itself was folding inward, drawn by the power of the binding ritual. I staggered to my feet, searching for Marcus amid the waning gloom. He lay curled on the ground, the ancient tome clutched protectively against his chest. With trembling hands, we helped each other up. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, replaced by a suffocating silence. The altar cracked down the middle, leaking tendrils of pale mist that quickly dissipated. I realized the nightmares had retreated or were forcibly sealed away. But had we done enough? The final hour. Gasping and bruised, we staggered back to the second door. Before stepping through, I turned to glimpse the unseen realm one last time. Where there had been swirling darkness, I now saw only a haze of dull gray, shrinking rapidly in on itself, as if someone had pulled a plug from the center of a cosmic drain. We slipped through the doorway and slammed it shut. Back in the corridor, the runes we'd drawn on the floor were still glowing, but they soon dimmed. I pressed the key into the lock with finality, twisting it until I heard a resounding click. A sense of relief and sorrow washed over me. The barrier was sealed, hopefully for good. Together, Marcus and I re-entered the library. Early morning light peeked through the windows, illuminating centuries of dust and worn books. For once, the library felt empty, yet safe. In the coming days, I placed wards and posted warnings, determined to honor my bloodline's duty. Marcus returned home, haunted but alive. We never spoke openly of the horrors again, except in hushed tones late at night, checking to ensure no new nightmares had crept into our world. But sometimes, at the very edge of sleep, I catch glimpses, flickers of that realm, the pulsing shapes and twisting shadows. On the nights when the moon is high and the wind howls through the eaves, I think I hear faint whispers from behind that locked door, reminding me that nightmares never truly die, they only wait.